You talk about a strange story. Dr. Mary's monkey, how the unsolved murder of a doctor, a secret lab in New Orleans, and a cancer-causing monkey virus are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. Up next, Edward Haslam on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Noory. Now, you're going to take a journey with me tonight, and it is indeed a journey. Let me tell you, first of all, about our guest, Ed Haslam. Spent his first 35 years living in New Orleans. He personally heard and saw things that involved the investigation into the JFK assassination, the murder of one of his father's colleagues, and claims of biological weapons to be used for political purposes. Haslam's 1969 comment: if there is a bizarre global epidemic involving cancer and a monkey virus 30 years from now, at least we'll know where it came from, states his concerns very clearly. Here he is, Ed Haslam. Ed, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, George. I'm fine.
My pleasure. And I noticed a forward by a guy I respect a lot who's going to be our guest on Coast to Coast this coming Monday, Jim Mars. There he is.
Yes, Jim's been with me on this story for a long time, and he's been a great support, and I talk to him all the time, and it's good to have him on board. In fact, I'm doing the forward to a book, and he's doing the afterword to it that'll be released here in a couple of months now on a woman who's the witness in my book, and we'll talk about her a little bit, but it's Me and Lee, which is her relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. So Jim's definitely a member of the party here.
Ed, this is an incredible story. And when I say incredible, I'm putting it in quotes and in big letters. It is one of the strangest mysteries that I have ever read or come across. But I want to ask you about you, first of all, because that is equally strange. I mean, you're not a doctor. You've been in what, the advertising business?
Yeah, and that was my career. I think of myself as a writer nowadays, but I grew up around medicine. My father was a professor at Tulane Medical School, which is how I got my initial leads on this story. And this story really came to me. I didn't go to it. I just grew up with the pieces surrounding me, and it was like I had this big puzzle, and one day I sat down and started to lay out the pieces and connect the dots. And the problem with the story, and I put problem in quotes there, is the fact that when you look at the story, each piece fits in with each other piece very cleanly and very logically, and it's only when you stand back and look at it that it looks really as strange as it does.
Tell us a little bit more about your background now, and then how you got involved in this kind of research.
Well, I am a professional writer by just due to my advertising background. But really, what you were talking about in the 1950s and 1960s, when I grew up in New Orleans, is where I started being handed the pieces of this. And it was all, I couldn't explain it to anybody because I didn't have the Internet and the libraries and the documentation that we have today. And it wasn't until, and I did have this fear, as you pointed out by the quote, from 1969, that we were going to have this terrible global epidemic involving cancer and a monkey virus. But that was difficult to explain to people, too, until it showed up. And then in the 1980s, when the mainstream scientific establishment started saying that AIDS was a mutation of a monkey virus, I started to have real serious concerns. And then I heard some information about some similar sounding stuff in New Orleans, which all tracked with these pieces of the puzzle that I'd collected over the years. And I said, somebody has got to lay all this stuff out and compare what we know about the people that were mutating monkey viruses in New Orleans in 1960 and this never-seen-before global epidemic that's killed more people than war that's sweeping the planet today. And I initially really started looking for the flaw in the argument because I wasn't really anxious to be the messenger on this, and it's not a particularly happy story to come out with, but when you start to realize the dimensions of what I talk about in the book, you realize that it was difficult for me not to write the book once I realized what was at stake. And I felt the American people and the people of the world, because it affects all of us, really had the right to know what has happened to us, because we're not being told by the mainstream media. And in fact, they're party to the hiding of all of it.
And you believe that cancer is caused by a virus, don't you?
Well, it's not a question of my believing it. It's today, well, for the second half of the 20th century, from 1960 to about 2000, that was the official position of the medical community, was cancer could not be caused by a virus. In fact, I have a document from the American Cancer Society that lists 200 possible causes of cancer, and the word virus is not even in there.
Good point. Ed, stay with us. We're going to be right back on Coast to Coast as we talk about Dr. Mary's monkey. Yes, we'll tell you about Dr. Mary as well when we come back. Our guest tonight, Ed Heslam's with us for the full program, author of Dr. Mary's Monkey, and it's an incredible mystery. It's an incredible story. If you like podcasting, by the way, you might want to pick up Streamlink for just pennies a day, so you're guaranteed always having these shows for you, no matter where you go. Simply go to coasttocoastam.com and sign up for Streamlink. Back in a moment with Ed Heslam on Coast to Coast AM. And you were talking about how the medical community had 200 some potential thoughts on cancer, but at no point did they mention viruses.
Yes, and before that, right before, that started in about 1960. In 1959, I have a copy of Time magazine from July of 1959, and the cover article on it talks about the new war on cancer through virus research and chemotherapy. And in that article, they talk about two of the women that play a big role in Dr. Mary's Monkey. One is Sarah Stewart, who was the scientist who proved the existence of the cancer-causing virus in 1957. And the other one was Bernice Eddy, who we'll be talking about more later, and she was Stewart's research partner. And the two of them discussed the possibility, since they have proven way back in the 50s that viruses cause cancer, that there might be the possibility for a cancer vaccine. Now, we're sitting here in 2010, and the pharmas are marketing the HPV vaccine, which is the human papillomavirus. So they can no longer say that viruses don't cause cancer because they're out there marketing a vaccine to stop a cancer-causing virus. So they've run out of excuses now. And when I started talking about this story back in 1995, I was way out on a limb by myself talking about cancer-causing viruses. But here we are 15 years later, and the scientific community has finally come around.
Who is Mary? Dr. Mary's Monkey. Who is Mary?
Well, Mary is Dr. Mary Sherman. She was from the Midwest originally, from Illinois, and she went to the University of Chicago Medical School. And for those who are not familiar with that, that's a big powerhouse owned by the Rockefellers. It's every bit as prestigious as Stanford or Harvard or any of those other places, but it's a little bit lower profile, because it tends to really involve the Nobel Prize level scientists more than the football teams or the student body.
Sure, and it's it's in the Midwest, Ed, where I am right now, and generally colleges, and there's some darn good ones. Washington University being one of them here in St. Louis. You're right; they're low key. They don't have that Ivy League feel to it at all, and so people kind of brush over it. It's one of the great medical schools in our country.
Yes, and Mary Sherman was from there, and some of the things that are unusual about her is, first of all, she was officially an orthopedic surgeon, which is a bone doctor, which my father was also. My father tended to be more of the surgeon, the guy in the operating room with the scalpel. She, however, was more of a pathologist. She studied the nature of disease itself. In fact, she was the chairman or chairperson, whatever you call it nowadays, of the pathology committee of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. And the other thing about her was she was a world-class expert in the use of radiation. And she is published in that area, and I have a list of her articles presented in Dr. Mary's Monkey. The point about this, at the University of Chicago at the time, we find people like Enrico Fermi, who did the first sustained nuclear reaction, and Harold Urey, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project during World War II. I mean, they have the biggest brains in the country in radiation at the University of Chicago right at the time that she is there studying radiation and writing articles about it for the medical community. And then in 1952, she gets an invitation to come to New Orleans. And why someone would give up Chicago and all that for New Orleans, I think there were some personal things going on in Mary's life, which we can talk about later. But she comes down to New Orleans. She has a very attractive package. She is given a position on the faculty of Tulane Medical School, which at the time was one of the top medical schools in the country. She's runs a cancer laboratory for Dr. Alton Ochsner at the Ochsner Clinic, and that's one of the big regional medical clinics, kind of like the Mayo Clinic. And she, of course, gets a nice medical practice with that. So that's when she comes down to New Orleans. And because she's on the faculty of Tulane Medical School in the same department with my father and her are very good friends. So that's a real connection. She actually comes out to the house one night. She had to entertain the president of the Royal Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons when he was touring the United States. And frankly, she wanted another male at the dinner table who could talk to the guy about old war stories and stuff. Sure. So she brought my father along, and they came over to the house after dinner to continue a conversation that, frankly, they didn't want to have in the restaurant where other people might overhear them. And so they were very close friends. And when Mary Sherman was murdered, it was a kind of a big event in my family because she was one of my father's best friends. And the fact that it was a front page murder for 2 weeks in New Orleans, a very bizarre mystery that nobody seemed to be able to figure out.
And tell us, Ed, a little bit about this murder, if you would.
Well, there's like two sides to the coin. There's what the public was told and what I found out really happened.
Tell us what the public was told first.
Okay. The public was told that an intruder went into Mary Sherman's apartment, stabbed her to death, and set her on fire. And her body was found naked in the smoldering apartment, and they went around looking for a psychopathic sex slasher. And that was the public story, and everybody kind of wanted to take two steps back and say, oh, yeah, I met her once, but I didn't really know her, that kind of stuff. And 30 years or so, about 28 years after her murder, which was in 1964, I actually got her autopsy report and police report out of the public library. And they had been locked in the chief of police desk in the intervening 28 years.
In his desk?
In his desk, yeah. And, in fact, at one point, I asked a guy who was a professional murder investigator for Orleans Parish. I mean, that was his job. He worked for the DA's office.
Yeah.
I asked him if he could get me a copy of the police report on that. He said, yeah, sure, no problem. I do it all the time. I'll get it for you 48 hours. And when I called him back in 48 hours, he said, what did you get me into? He said, I almost got fired over this, and I've been answering questions. And when I tell them some teenage kid asked me to get this, they all laugh at me. He said, what is going on with this murder? And when I finally, nobody knew was the problem. When I finally got a hold of the autopsy report, I discovered that, yes, Mary Sherman had been stabbed, but there's a lot of situational stuff here. The real issue was that her entire right arm and right rib cage had been disintegrated by heat. Now, she's in a wood frame building. There's curtains next to her bed that didn't catch on fire. There's a paper label on the sherry bottle that didn't catch on fire. There's human hair next to this carbonized burn, and you can see into her body and see her organs. I mean, this is all in the official documents, and this is what was not told to the press. I mean, this is like saying, forgetting to tell the press that Nicole Simpson's throat got cut. I mean, it's the major fact in the case.
Now, was anybody ever arrested or convicted?
No. No,
Okay.
the police stood up and said, well, this is one we're not going to be able to solve, so everybody back to work, I mean, they officially did that 2 weeks after the murder, and that's when the files got locked up and nobody was there, and everybody in town, I mean, the rumor mill was going crazy, and, of course, you have to realize my mother is married to my father, and my father works at the medical school where Mary teaches. So the whole rumor mill down in the medical school, the grapevine down there, is going nuts about what's going on, and they keep talking about the burglar alarm to Mary's apartment was turned off. All right, this was not a burglary. Okay, and so they all think she knew her assailant. And what I finally figured out, I said, okay, what burned off her arm? The toaster? I mean, there's nothing in her apartment that could do that damage to her body. So you're logically left with the inescapable point that whatever happened to Mary Sherman's right arm and ribcage did not happen in her apartment. Therefore, you're looking at a situation where somebody threw her body in a body bag, brought it back to her apartment, and faked a murder scene.
Now, why would they disintegrate her arm? What's the purpose of that?
Let's start with the what disintegrated the arm issue.
Okay.
Because the only way you can do that is like with millions of volts of electricity. I mean, we're talking about a lightning strike here. It doesn't even do damage like that. So we're talking about something that's, I'm going to call an industrial accident for the moment, involving a massively powerful piece of electronic equipment that Mary obviously had access to, and she obviously grabbed something with her right hand, and it blew out her arm like it was a spark plug or a fuse. Okay?
Okay.
And when I discussed this with doctors, and I've had a lot of people help me with this on the way, and one of these doctors had a lot of experience with high voltage burns, and he said, Ed, what I can't figure out reading this autopsy report is why her feet didn't come off. I mean, normally the electricity goes to the ground. He said, here, her arm is gone, but her feet are fine. So what's going on? Well, I mean, it took me years to sort all this out, but we finally found the building that the equipment was in, and it had a steel wall in it. Why did it have a steel wall in it? To protect the operators from the radiation. They had a 5 million volt linear particle accelerator hidden in uptown New Orleans on U.S. government property. And this metal wall had a cable attaching it to the ground so that electrons and stuff would be routed to the ground, and she was standing in front of the wall when she grabbed the circuit breaker switch, and somebody, in my opinion, booby-trapped that facility. Now, when did this happen? Why did they booby-trap it? Let's look at this. The date is July 21st, 1964.
Okay, so it's after the Kennedy assassination.
Right, but it's the day the Warren Commission starts their investigation in New Orleans.
This is interesting. Okay, and you're going to be tying this together.
Oh, yeah.
It's a bizarre story.
It all fits like a puzzle.
Okay, so she's in there working. Are you saying that this burn was a radiation burn on her?
It was electrical. Now irradiation's electrical. I think what happened, I mean, I've talked to technical people, and some people think it could be a radiation burn. I think what happened is there was just so much electricity required to run this linear particle accelerator, and somebody wanted to expose the location of this laboratory, so they booby-trapped it. And she went in there, and when she flipped on the switch, all that electricity of 5 million volts all came back into her hand. And she was standing in front of the steel wall. And you're talking about a flash bulb of violence here. But what didn't happen was the electricity did not cross her heart.
All right. So she's not dead. She's in horrible pain, but she's still alive at this point.
She's
right?
still alive. Her heart is still beating. Her right arm is gone. Her rib cage is gone. You can see her lungs and liver, and somebody is there with her. and they take a very slim, very precise instrument, only about a quarter-inch wide, and they lift her left breast, and they poke this instrument between her fifth and sixth rib cage into her heart.
Why did they decide to kill her?
Well, she's blind, she's maimed, she will never recover, and the clock is running. They've got to get her out of there.
And how do they explain what happened to her?
They don't. I mean, this is a secret.
No, that's the point. They have to do her in, I guess.
That's right. And I understand your question now. The rhetorical, how did they explain it?
Exactly.
Yeah, they it's a mercy killing at that point in time, and then she's at the U.S. Public Health Service hospital. Okay, there's about 13 buildings on this campus, and she's in one of the buildings on the back. Today, it's very interesting. I've been to this building recently. It looks like a set from a horror movie. Okay, the other 12 buildings on this facility, which is now run by the state of Louisiana as a hospital, are in perfect condition. The buildings themselves were all built back around 1910 or so. They're all brick and stuff. But this one building that the particle accelerator was in, the roof is caving in, the shutters are falling off. You wouldn't even want to walk into it. And I've talked to people who've been in the building because they were looking at renting it for a laboratory and stuff. And they just said it's in deplorable situation. But what you find in there is you find that there's a room down in the bottom that's like circular shape. And right in the center of that room, it kind of looks like an operating room, but everything is asbestos. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything is asbestos. And what they had in there was they had a platinum pyramid to divide the beam of the linear particle accelerator because they were reflecting equal doses into these chambers because there is a series of chambers around this room, and that's where they were putting the monkey viruses. And they were deliberately...
Yeah, let's jump ahead for a second, Ed, only because there's this tie-in where you write in your book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Can I read a part here?
Yeah, please.
It says, it unveils the contamination of hundreds of millions of doses of the polio vaccine with dozens of monkey viruses. It spotlights the epidemic of soft tissue cancers that swept our country, and it exposes dangerous secret experiments which used radiation to mutate cancer, causing monkey viruses. Now, are you saying that this was going on in this Frankenstein-looking building, and Dr. Mary Sherman was part of it?
The third of the 3 points, yes. But in order to understand this, and I want to think about this from your listener's point of view at this point, what's causing all this? Where is this coming from? Why is this an issue? Why were they doing this? This whole thing goes back to the polio vaccine of the 1950s. And you were talking about the car industry earlier. They make about 30 million cars a year. These people had to make 200 million doses of the polio vaccine. Didn't have to, but that's what they were assigned to do. And in order to do that, they grew the polio virus to make the vaccines. They grew the polio virus on monkey kidney cells from the rhesus monkey. And that was the method of production. And this has to do with all this science that doesn't get much publicity, but it's all going on in the background. And after they released the 200 million doses of the polio vaccine in 1955 through 57, after they had done that, that is when they discovered the cancer-causing virus, originally named polyoma. This was discovered by Sarah Stewart and Bernice Eddy at the National Institute of Health in 1957. And by 1959, they had confirmed that the cancer-causing virus was in the polio vaccine.
So in this mystery, as we're unraveling tonight, Ed, we talk about this local murder in New Orleans of this doctor, and you're connecting it to what could very well be one of the biggest medical issues of mankind.
Yes, this is the biggest mistake in the history of government. I mean, they mass inoculated the entire American population and then some with a cancer-causing virus. And when I read this, and this doctor, I used to talk to him a couple of times a week, and he really beat me up to find this book, and I finally found this book, and it was called The Health Century, written by Edward Shorter, who is a professor of medical history up at the University of Toronto, and the book had been used as the basis of the PBS series called The Health Century, and he had a chapter on this discovery of the cancer-causing virus. And then I said, I've got to get the statistics on this from NCI and see if this is real.
Now, let's get to the second point when we come back, Ed, and you won't believe this one. We'll be right back.